Hey everyone, welcome to part 5 of painting Glutos, and this week I painted a lot of stuff, but the main thing I did was these gold horns which come on the back of another Slanesh model, and I absolutely love the shape of them, and I was kind of looking forward to painting them, but I thought they would be really hard. Actually, they're so plain, they were really nice to paint, probably one of the most enjoyable parts, and I was really happy with how the non-metallic gold came out. And there's plenty of tutorials on the Cult of Paint channel for non-metallic gold because it's something I paint a lot and it comes up. You know, even in the last tutorial with Elrond, it came up. So I wondered, well, what can I do that's a bit different in this video that could be useful and interesting? So in this video, I want to focus on tone, and it's something that even in my non-metallic metal workshops, I don't focus on tons because I think the most important thing for non-metallic metal is getting the volumes right. So that's the placement of the highlights and the size of them. But the tone I do talk about briefly, but I thought it'd be really nice to go into like a deep dive of why I choose the colours I do and the little journey I went on to try and find a gold that I personally like. When I returned to painting after a hiatus, as many of us do, it was about 2014, maybe the very end of 2013, but I pretty much started with non-metallic metals straight away and just kept working on it. Red and gold came up a lot in my paint jobs back in those days, and one of the things I was happiest with was Magnus the Red. I think this was 2016, and this was probably my most elaborate paint job, and I took it to Golden Demon and stuff like that. And overall, I was really happy with the model. It was insanely detailed, and at the time, it was one of my, neatest jobs, most complex. I was really happy with the freehand on the back. I think that's one of my better freehands, but there was one thing I wasn't super happy with, and that was the tone of the non-metallic metal gold. I won the Golden Demon with it, so, that was great and I was happy. But personally, I'm not one for being complacent, and even though I got a win, which was brilliant, I thought, do you know what, I'm actually not happy with the tone. I've got a lot of things right and I'm still learning, but the colour just isn't quite there. And a lot of my friends thought I was crazy because, not straight away, but very soon after, I went into painting Rogel Dawn, which is obviously another Primarch, super complicated, and it's just full of non-metallic metal gold. And this was just to try and improve the tone that I got, no other reason really. I mean, I love Rogel Dawn. At the time I was really into Primarchs. Probably won't paint one again for a long time, but yeah, at the time I was super into it and I just wanted to get better. And I remember painting specifically the back of the calf, and this was where I was like, this is way better. I think it's a lot better than Magnus the Red. In my head, this was the look of the gold I wanted. And in general, I think it's because it's slightly less yellow feeling overall, and there's a lot of little things that change the bigger picture. But I thought it'd be fun to compare the exact tones I use side by side, which I've never done. I was happier at the time and I knew why, but I'd never put them side by side. So I thought it'd be interesting for this video as part of the journey to get to where I am today, just to compare that. They actually used almost exactly the same paints, which I'm going to talk about later before we get into painting, but it was the proportions and the saturation mostly. The problem, I think, with Magnus, and every time I give feedback to people, this comes up a lot, but there's too much mid-tone on show. And that's because everything is highlighted, including an edge highlight. And the problem if you do that is everything feels brighter. So the plate on the hip, I actually think, it looks great, but it is just really yellowish overall. And I think what I needed was some more desaturated highlights and then more of the shadow on show. If you compare to the calf on the back of Dawn, there's way more shadow and a lot less of the saturated yellow. Then if you look at the tones that I've put side by side, the second from brightest, that's the most important thing. And you can just see how way more desaturated the tones are in Dawn. I think it's interesting because if you looked at the 4 colours I've pulled out for Dawn, which are from the back of the calf, some of the other tones are different, like on the backpack, but that bit on the calf, it doesn't look like it would be gold in the end. If I had those colours on the palette, I'd be thinking, well, this isn't going to look gold. But the specific type of gold I like is desaturated. So I think we'll look at some references now to kind of see the gold that I like. I was on my old computer looking for pictures of Dawn and Magnus because I don't have them on my new one, and I came across this reference photo which I used to really enjoy and show in my non-metallic classes. And the reason I like it, if you look at the lion's head, is how small the highlights are, and most of it is kind of just that really dark brown. But then because we have those really bright lights in the end, that's what makes it feel shiny. And the important thing here is the really yellow colour is just a transition to that very bright spot highlight, but there's hardly any of that yellow colour on show in general. So most of it is the dark brown. Then we have a short transition of the really yellow, the really gold colour, and then it jumps into the kind of ice yellow, really bright tone. And that's, I think, what I got wrong in Magnus was there was too much mid-tone on show. I needed to either paint more shadow or paint my highlights more desaturated and have that yellow colour just less of it, I think. I definitely think because I was edge highlighting every panel line as neat as I could, that's probably why it felt too mid-tony in the end. And now, with a bit more knowledge, I know that sometimes you need to be more reserved on the edge highlights and barely highlight it at all. You need a little bit of definition, but if everything is bright, then it will feel bright overall. And it's really important that when you do things like edge highlights, which bring definition, they don't affect the overall view. And when you're trying to achieve a more realistic, impactful non-metallic metal, this is super important. If we look at this part on the lion head, there's like a trim, and that's a really typical part where if it was on a model, you'd probably edge highlight the whole thing. But in the center where it's shadowed, it doesn't get brighter. And if you highlight that, then it's going to ruin this effect. So I thought that's quite a cool example. Another good example, which comes from my old references, is this kind of chest armor, and it's obviously got some artificial light shined on it, so it's pretty extreme, but it does teach that lesson that most of it is going to look cooler, in my opinion, if it's that dark brownish color. And then again, the yellow tone is really just to take you into that bright light. And if you refer back to the other Glutos videos when we talked about the skin and we're jumping from the shadow straight to the light nice and quick, it's very similar to that. And I think, yeah, if you have too much mid-tone on show, then it ruins the effect of non-metallic metal. The other thing I like here is the orange bounce light, which we'll talk about later. And I think that this happens when gold's reflecting from some other gold. That's to my knowledge and what I understand anyway. When I see gold next to each other, you tend to get a bounce of a more orange tone. But it's very useful to have a secondary light like this that's different in tone because it will make the main one look brighter. As a polar opposite, I got this image, which is a really nice one for understanding, volumes. And here you have that really broad main highlight, a very small amount of shadow, and then a super orange kind of bounce light. But the important thing here is this is the color of gold I don't like, when it's super rich, super orange. And I think some people will like this. I know a lot of painters do really bright gold. That's not really my thing. I always want it to be a little more antique-like, kind of an old gold, desaturated. So I have to say that because this video is going to hinge towards that, and there's definitely so many ways to achieve non-metallic metal gold. I just want to take you through my journey, how I got to painting it like I do, and why I choose the tones. I entered my Saint Celestine into Golden Demon last year, but the funny thing with this model is I painted it I think all the way back at the end of 19, and I put it away for 3 years because of, the big C that won't be named. But it's funny because this is the brightest gold I've ever done, and I did it in a different technique to try and achieve something else. I started with the brightest colour, almost a pure white, and I glazed all the colours working backwards. And this was good because I got a crazy bright looking gold, a smooth result with an immense amount of contrast. But it's not the aesthetic I really love. I'm really proud of these, and it's funny because I painted them in 2019, I entered them in 2022, and I think if I was painting them in 2022, I wouldn't have done this gold because my tastes change slowly over time, and definitely I used to prefer really bright, bold colours, and as time goes on, I'm a little more subdued and enjoying more subtle, desaturated things. So yeah, that's just how it evolves. So I really enjoyed this as an exercise, and it did improve sort of my gold. I remember doing the top of the wings. That was brilliant because all of that was just a bright ice yellow colour, and I just glazed all those little things in. And it was very fast, but because we're painting over a pale base coat, all of my colours turned out very vivid, which is impressive, and it stands out, but I don't really like that kind of feeling in my gold these days. Let's talk about paints now. So English Uniform, I think, has a little bit of fame for gold. It's a very popular paint for painting non-metallic gold. I think a lot of the Europeans started using it, and that's where I kind of heard about it for painting non-metallics. And the reason is it's that desaturated brownish yellow kind of tone, and when people paint really bright non-metallics, they won't use this, but for the kind of tone I like, it definitely helps using this paint. It's just one of the best ones around for it. And if you look at it in the pot, it looks incredibly boring, but it has, just the right amount of yellowish to form your shadow colours and also your mid-tones. I've got the AK one next to it, and they're very different. They look similar in the pot, but they behave so differently. It took me a while to get used to the AK. It's more saturated, but it's also smoother and less grainy. I find it easier to get a smooth finish, like a really clean looking result with the British Uniform from AK. So I think overall, I'll probably switch to using that. But yeah, it is more vibrant, and that took some getting used to, but I find it more versatile, and in the end, I think I can get a better result. The highlight colour is probably the least important. I've got 3 here, they're all fine. You can achieve all of these for non-metallic gold, you just have to control them in a different way. I think that's the most important thing to learn, is how you control your tones. So ivory is the least yellow, so it's going to desaturate everything more. Pale sand is a really nice colour actually. I'm using that tons at the moment because it's just got a nice amount of colour, and if your final highlight is pale sand, it's it's a really good off-white, but you get a lot more power out of it because of the colour. Pastel yellow is fantastic, but I tend to not use this one at the moment because then your final highlight feels a little too yellow. Like we said earlier, I want to have yellow in the midtones, and I actually want to kill the colour, so I prefer my final highlight to be more desaturated using the pale sand or ivory, and I get my yellow tone from the previous colours. The yellow, which makes it feel really gold, I like to use this Japanese Uniform. Again, the model colour behaves very differently from the AK, and the AK is a lot more saturated. It's subtle in the British Uniform, but it's way less subtle with the Japanese Uniform. And I think I said in my earlier video with gold that I tried using this AK one and it didn't work, so I switched it out for the model colour. But when I painted the horns, I tried the AK one again, and you just have to use it more sparingly. So I mix the Japanese Uniform with the English Uniform, and I don't ever use Japanese Uniform pure. And I think when I painted Magnus, I used a highlight with Japanese Uniform straight out the pot, and that's actually a touch too yellow. So in general, I tend to not use any Japanese Uniform straight out the pot. It's got some ivory to desaturate in it. It's got some English Uniform to desaturate. On its own, I think that gives a very yellow feeling. And if you want that bright yellow gold, of course, it's great. But again, I think now I've got used to it, I do think the AK is more advantageous overall. So these are the final paints I use, and we've got Rhinox hide in there as well, and when I go to mixing the paints, you'll see how important Rhinox hide is. But yeah, these four are kind of my mainstay for painting gold. I do always try and mix it up and experiment with other colours all the time, but my go-tos are going to be these. And I think if you're learning non-metallic gold, it's hard enough as it is without any other variables, so just stick to an easy recipe, get to grips with it, then you can kind of mix it up with the colours and things like that. But if I'm doing a workshop, these are the four I tend to go for. They're kind of fail-safe for me. But it's not as simple as base coating Rhinox hide, then doing British uniform, then Japanese and ivory. You can't just go through them simply like that. Within these four, there are kind of important key tones, and yeah, it's not as straightforward. Like, you can see the difference between Magnus and Dawn, and they're basically the same four paints, but the application is crazy important. A last note, for doing orange bounce lights, I haven't found an ultimate combination for this, but Mournfang Brown is fantastic for gold in general. You can use that in the main lights as well, but it's really good for doing a more orange tone in a reflection. And orange brown I've used tons recently. I used it for Elrond, I used it for the orc skin on the owl, and it's just such a nice paint. I don't know why, but it goes on really, really smooth. So absolutely love this one, and because it is so smooth and reliable and a not particularly vibrant orange, I think that makes it useful for gold. And I was mixing orange brown with a little bit of the British uniform, and it turned out a lot like snakebite leather actually, and a lot of people find themselves a bit lost without snakebite leather, but with these colours I feel absolutely fine. So we're going to do some painting now, and I'll talk about the mixes as I go. Here I've got the pre-highlight, and one thing I don't like is starting pale, because when we paint yellow over black, it turns it greenish. So if we want a pure yellow, it's not a good thing. But with gold, there is that green kind of feeling to it in the background. So I actually prefer to start from pure black with gold. And when we've done other things in this video, like the skin, we started really pale. But for gold, I find it a hindrance for the specific look I'm going for. So I ended up just blocking it in Rhinox hide, but here I'm sort of starting the base coat with English uniform, but already it feels too yellowish, and I want it much darker than this. So let's go back to the palette and get some darker tones. So I'm going to go for Rhinox hide as my darkest tone, and what I did on this one differently was, instead of having one mix between Rhinox hide and the English uniform, I'm going to say that paint name a lot in this video, I ended up making 3 different tones before I even got there, and these are really useful colours to have interesting shadows, get that green feeling, and I think it was worth it. So the first one is Rhinox hide with a really, really small amount of English uniform mixed in, and that's just to kill the redness of Rhinox hide, and yeah, you can see it's a really subtle change. Then I have one that's English uniform with only a tiny bit of Rhinox hide in, and you can see next to the pure English uniform just subtly knocks it down, and I think that is the really key colour to make your shadows, your midtones feel that really antique looking gold. And then of course I have a colour in between just to bridge the gap. But what's important to me, and what I did differently in this, is having those 3 mixes of Rhinox hide and English uniform. And you can see they're subtly different, but important to getting a really smooth, beautiful looking gold. I've got a little splodge of highlight colour, and that's just a point to show me where I want to end up my brightest point to be, so it's kind of just planning. But here I'm just starting with the Rhinox hide mixed with English uniform. I'm kind of re-base coating and leaving the Rhinox hide in the top here. And I'll cover over that point where the light is. I can refer back to a picture of it, and I pretty much know where I'm going anyway. But here the paint's really diluted, and I'm pushing it towards the light, away from that Rhinox hide. And I find these early stages are the most labour intensive, just building up slowly, and actually doing the brighter highlights are really quick because you're working in a small space. But I found I've got the best results when I really take my time to lay down these first few tones nice and smooth, nice and diluted, and just get a really clean and clear beginning. So I move up now to the English uniform with a tiny bit of Rhinox hide in. So it's the final one before pure English uniform. And you can see here I'm not really base coating. I'm starting with a thin line that fades into the broad area at the bottom. And the paint is fairly diluted, so you might need a couple coats of each tone. But for me, yeah, it's about really taking my time. And this is for Golden Demon, so I'm being particularly anal about every little layer being spot on. Now mixing a really key colour. So this is going to be British khaki with a little bit of the Japanese uniform in. And I'm doing an enormous puddle here because I want my paint to not dry out, because I want to mix this colour up and just kind of finish this whole thing. But you can see this looks really golden on the palette, and the two together are just excellent. And I'll never go, like I said, to a pure Japanese uniform, but having probably 2 tones of this is going to be useful. I've really emphasized the tones in this video because the process is actually fairly simple. You can see I'm just layering up, and I've got this kind of thin shape because it's slightly rounded, these horns. It's not flat. So I'm painting it almost like a mellow cylinder, and it'll get wider at the bottom. But the actual painting process isn't that complex. It's just layering and really taking my time. You can see though, I'm always paying attention to my brushstroke direction, and I'm always trying to push the pigment towards the light when I'm building up these highlights. But yeah, yellow is obviously really bad for opacity. It doesn't go on well, but I think that makes it easier to get a smooth kind of finish, so long as you're patient enough to keep going with it. Now I'm going to start adding ivory to that mix, and this is where it doesn't get complicated, but I don't want to lose my precise colour. I mean, it's easy to find it again, but we've got 3 paints mixed together, which is obviously more difficult than when you've just got 2, but this is where we're controlling the saturation, and I think that's so important. The whole time you need to just manage how vibrant is this gold looking, and there's a difference between how saturated the tone is than the contrast of the values, right? So you can have something really yellow, super vibrant, or have those desaturated tones, but they still have bright highlights. So my clip was so bad, my head was in the way of the whole thing. But again, it's just repeating the same process. So here I've added more ivory to the first layer, and at this point it doesn't look gold at all. That's because you have shadows and you have midtones, and it won't feel gold until we get to the final light. And again, even I was like, this isn't looking too gold. I hope it goes okay in the end. And yeah, it did, obviously. But yeah, at this point, it might not feel gold, but you just need to push it all the way to the end. But you can see how desaturated this highlight is. And personally, I think it's looking really nice already. And just taking a long time with the layering is getting a nice result. Now I'm focusing on a spotlight where I really want it to shine. So I'm probably going to leave the right hand side and put all the focus into one area here. And that's obviously specific for this shape, but in general you want to just eventually not highlight everything and draw attention to a particular focal area. And that's what I did with Dawn's calf. Is there's just a spot running up it, and there's one point where it's a little bit brighter. So we obviously have the main volume running up the entire calf, but then I think a little highlight spot means it doesn't look too bright and crazy overall, and it helps draw your eye where you want people to look. More ivory here, still not a pure ivory, and I'll probably use some pure ivory just on this main part. But I'm using sort of smaller brush strokes now. We started with really big, broad ones. Now I'm trying to be really precise and just get these small parts. And that's actually the finished result. So it's not a crazy amount of steps. The process of layering isn't incredibly complicated. You've got to have an understanding of the highlight shapes and the volumes, and that's a whole other kind of subject really. But this one, I just wanted to focus on tone because it comes up so much, and this is going to be a half-hour video basically just about gold tones, and I don't really get the opportunity to do that in the other videos because they'll be insanely long, but hopefully this is one I can refer back to whenever I do a gold tutorial with a similar recipe. Tried adding some orange bounce lights in the top of the horns, but I felt it lost the effect and just looked better with a plain shadow. And it's not particularly complicated how I've painted this piece in general. It's fairly simple, but I just wanted to focus on that strong main light and yeah, just a really nice, clean and clear job, to be honest. Before doing this really important part, I actually kind of practiced on the other parts of the base, and they're a lot smaller with the spiky bits on the side and things like that, and these were a lot easier just because less real estate makes it easier to get all those colors in there. But I have to say it was horrible doing all of this gold on this miniature. It was just crazy how much of it was, and horrible shapes as well on the back, just some weird flat areas and stuff like that. So it was a real challenge getting all of the gold done on this base, but the horns were fantastic. And when you're learning non-metallic gold, make sure you do it on a pleasant miniature. I suggest doing some details first before you do an entire miniature like Dawn or something like that. Just do, a bit of a sword or something, and that'll be way more pleasant. I do hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's a niche within a niche subject and not everybody loves non-metallic metal, but for those of you who are trying to conquer it or improve on it, I really hope deep diving specifically into the colours I like to use has been useful. So please tell me if it is. And I think, when I do videos in the future, then it's going to be good to refer back to this one. And it's something I've never done in this detail. It's going to be almost half hour just kind of talking about the colours I like to use for gold. So I hope it's been interesting for a lot of you. I will have one final part finishing Glutos, which will probably be more like a video diary because there's nothing major, just some small details like a bong and a hand as some food. So it'll be a funny one, but I'm also going to edit it after Adepticon, and I'll talk about my experience of the competition and just what painting this project was like. It's been intense, and I will say the base was way harder than the mini just because the sheer amount of stuff. But based on the last video where we conquered the large flat areas, I'm actually feeling much better at painting in general because I've got better at painting those big flat areas. Anyway, less waffle. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you the final result.